A few years ago, I graduated college after majoring in English. I moved back in with my parents in the summer, but come fall I was still having trouble finding a job. My dad said I had to start looking for any kind of work, not just the adult job that I wanted, because it was time that I started paying rent. So I let out a sigh and I looked for part-time jobs. I found one that was on a farm. It started in October and went through to the first week of November. The farmer who owned the land had decided to put on a little side business this year, and had a haunted corn maze set up along with crafts tables for the kids and other activities. My job was as an actor, if you want to call it that, playing a scarecrow in the corn maze. When kids or families would walk by, my job was simply to wait just long enough for them to think I was a scarecrow and then prove their initial instinct right by jumping down and chasing after them a bit. Some days it was a little hot, some days it was a little too cold, and some days the straw in my shirt just kept itching, but overall it was a pretty fun gig. I only lasted about 2 weeks, however. I didn't get fired or anything, I quit. At about 10 a.m. on October 19th, a family of 3 came through the maze. A mother, a father, and their only child. As expected, as they approached me, they thought, oh boy, this is probably a human, and the parents took a step back. The child, however, just stood still, just staring at me. I figured this must be his first rodeo. He looked kinda young to be in a scary maze, but I guess it was pretty tame as far as haunted mazes went. The family collected themselves and again began following the path in the corn. I dropped down and lifted my hands by my face. Again, the man jumped back, and the woman screamed, clutching her mouth. The boy just stood there, staring at me. No expression on his face whatsoever. It kind of creeped me out, if I'm being honest. But I waved to them as my cute little signature gesture, and got back up on my post, and they moved along through the maze. A couple more people came through after that. It wasn't the busiest day. But around noon, I saw a small head bobbing up through the corn. Coming down the path, it was clearly a child, and they were clearly alone. It was that kid from earlier, but somehow he'd given his parents the slip. He walked up to me. I turned my head to look at him. I didn't think it was necessary for me to jump down. He'd already seen the show. "Are you okay, bud? Did you lose your parents?" I asked. The creepiest little smile I've ever seen appeared on the child's face. He reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a pair of Crayola scissors from the crafting table. Before I could even react, he swung them open and plunged them into my right thigh. I was too shocked to vocalize, but I reached down for his hand, and he ran away. The pain started to show up as my shock subsided, and I limped through the corn maze back out to the main field. My heart was pounding as I reached the clearing, imagining what I would say to this kid's parents or to my boss and how the situation would even go down. But he wasn't at the crafting table. He was pulling away in the car with his parents, looking out the back window and smiling at me. My boss came rushing over when he saw the red pooling on my tattered long johns. I tried to explain to him what had happened with the kid, but we didn't know who they were. He wasn't willing to call the police either, or an ambulance, but he drove me to the hospital. The thought of going into work was just too disturbing the next day. It was a minor injury, but just the look on that kid's face as he did something so heinous. I feel almost certain that wherever he is, years from now, he will be a serial killer. And hopefully, he'll never know where I work again. Last fall, I asked my son to clean up some leaves in the backyard. The lazy fella piled them up, but didn't bag them. The big pile sat out all night, letting the wind blow it apart, and in the morning I discovered it was there when I let the dog out to pee. Missy was a 2-year-old golden retriever, and she loved getting up to mischief. So when she saw that pile, you bet she ran over to it. When she was a puppy, she loved to play in the leaves the same as the kids, rolling around in them, jumping into them and bounding out. But today something was weird. When she approached the pile, she stopped in her tracks. She began circling it, then growling, showing her teeth and taking an aggressive stance. I walked out to see what was going on, but whatever it was definitely within the pile. At a moment's notice, she bounded in. I ran over as snarling continued and leaves flew off the pile. I saw her tail wagging as she backed out. She was holding on to something. I wasn't even sure what it was when I saw it, but it was a raccoon. It looked bloated and sickly. I commanded Missy to stand down. My wife had trained her well, thank God. The raccoon wasn't moving. It was just sitting there, looking like a big ugly balloon. Its eyes had a yellowish tinge to it. It almost looked like it couldn't walk, and I couldn't understand how it made it into the pile of leaves. I paced around it, and its eyes followed me. It was breathing heavily. I got Missy inside, and then came back out with my phone. I took a picture and then called animal control. They were there in an hour. I was worried about rabies, but they didn't seem to think that that's what it was. They swabbed the inside of its mouth just to be sure, and they whisked it away. Over the next couple days, Missy kept throwing up, but we couldn't figure out why. We got her into the vet as soon as we could, and they tested her for rabies, but she tested negative. By the time we got the test back, Missy seemed fine, and she's been fine for the last year. I don't know what was up with that raccoon, but it definitely left me feeling unsettled. I used to go stargazing at Tobermory with my dad. It's on the tip of a semi-remote peninsula called the Bruce Peninsula, which is situated between Lake Huron and Georgian Bay in Ontario. There's a single highway that leads there, and on the way back from Tobermory, we stopped by a forest fall fair. I'd always wanted to go to a small town gig like that. Being from the city and being used to fairs that were packed and noisy, this seemed like just the type of vibe I was intrigued by. It was filled with wonderful smells, homemade candles, sausage. There was a petting zoo, which smelled less wonderful, and a log sawing competition with a misery whip, otherwise known as a two-man saw. We entered, thinking it would be fun. There were only 2 other teams, but we beat them soundly. As the sun began to set, and we figured we better be hitting the road, I decided I need to pee before we left. But the door to the bathroom was locked, and I really didn't want to go into an outhouse. I decided I'd go for the woods, on the opposite side of the fairground from the road. My dad was perfectly happy to stay around a bit longer and check out some of the homemade jams. I love the smell of the fall, and the leaves were beautiful as I came up to them. But there were still kids running around where I was, so I figured I'd better go in a little bit deeper. I'm a little self-conscious that way. Once I felt I'd made it in plenty far, I began doing my business. I could still hear the sounds from the fairground on the breeze. Lots of chatter and children laughing and more log sawing. But I heard something else as well. There was chanting. And it wasn't coming from the fairground. And it was in a language that I wasn't familiar with. I peeked between the trees that formed the little alcove of my makeshift bathroom. My eyes didn't know what I was looking at. There was a number of people. Could have been 12, could have been 20. They were wearing sepia-tone colored robes and animal heads. They were real animal heads. They were circling a man hanging from a tree. They wore strange necklaces and carried odd-looking staves. The man, hanging upside down, looked at me. He was completely naked. The others stopped their chanting, stopped their pacing, and followed his eyes. All of them were looking at me. I don't know why it took so long for my fear response to kick in. but when it did, it was powerful. I pulled up my pants without checking if I was done and bolted. I felt like I made it across that field in 2 seconds. Luckily, I found my dad having just purchased his jams, and we got out of there. I don't know what I stumbled across in the forest, but I wonder if that hanging man had been in the process of finding out.